You can imagine how this might be a tough sell for a Jew who owns an ox, who's like following Deuteronomy 25 by taking off that muzzle, and then Paul's just like, this isn't about oxen. God doesn't care about oxen. Like you know, probably it's understandable why they might object to that.
Yeah, and whereas the fundamental claim that Paul makes, but to some degree it's shared by all the New Testament authors, is that the death and resurrection of Jesus marks a new era in God's plan. Not like God changed his mind and suddenly decided, hey, this Jew thing isn't working, I need to try something else. But rather, the claim that you find by Paul and other New Testament authors is, in some sense, all that stuff relating to the Israelites and the Jews was Act 1 of a 2-act play. And the coming of Jesus is the fulcrum on which things transition. And so in Act 1, you find a lot of things that aren't clear until you get to Act 2. You find in Act 1 a lot of things that foreshadow things are going to come up in Act 2. But it's only by watching the whole play that you can rightly understand a lot of things back there in Act 1. So the Christians are coming along and saying, making the rather audacious claim that the Jews do not rightly understand their own scriptures.
What influence had this translation on the development of Christianity, development of our world, we can say?
Yes. I mean, it's fascinating if we think about it. This is the first religious tradition really building itself up on translation.
And is he doing it rightly? Well, you know, traditionally historic Christians would say, yeah, because, I mean, he was Paul, you know, he was led by God. He was the one whose words got in the scriptures. We trust, we obey. We just have to say Paul got it all right. But for Paul, there's an issue of individual scrolls. And I just want to say one more word about that before we move on. If Paul wanted to consult these scrolls, where would he do it? People did not, very few people owned books in the ancient world. As we'll see in a minute, very few people could read or write. And certainly as Paul travels, he's not lugging around a stack of dozens of scrolls with him. And so really the only place you could consult a collection of scrolls was in the local Jewish synagogue. And even they would not necessarily have translations of all the texts. What mattered to them was the Torah, the first 5 books. And so we'll get into some questions later about, well, how much does Paul, he's quoting generally from memory, from when he had access to those texts. So to some degree, maybe we might summarize that Scripture is those texts that Paul has devoted to memory sometime in the course of his studies over the years and is able to meditate on, to ruminate on, to quote or allude to when he wants to. In some sense, that's then going to be a subset of the actual texts that we find in the Jewish scriptures, those that he has found important and relevant over the years.
Next, we have the fact that they often quote the Septuagint. And this becomes interesting because they don't always quote the Septuagint that we have. It may be one of those revised versions that I've mentioned, or revised versions which we don't actually have anymore, but we can see is a revision. So it's quite possible the authors chose which translation, which of the many versions of the translation that existed. They chose which was best for their particular argument. And in fact, it's quite possible they were aware of variants and that there were different versions. But finally, of course, the Septuagint, in translating into Greek from Hebrew, the Septuagint sometimes had to choose a particular word which would have a different vocabulary from the Hebrew. A good example is of course, the issue over the virgin birth. Isaiah 7 talks about an Alma, a maiden, which was translated into Greek as Parthenos, which can also mean just a maiden or a young girl or an unmarried woman, but also has a specific meaning in Greek of virgin. Now this may have been, again, unintentional in the translation of Isaiah, but once it was read in Greek and people saw the word as virgin, it then created the story of the virgin birth. So once it was read in Greek separate from the Hebrew by people who didn't necessarily think about the Hebrew background, it started to develop its own theological influence.
I mean, these things, we just don't realize how offensive these kinds of language and this way of, not only the language, but the mode of thinking is to a Jewish mindset. And you can start understanding why not many Jews listen to Paul in those days. I mean, he's really stomping on their toes consistently when they hear Paul is distorting the scriptures. Paul is twisting the scriptures to support his own views. And you know what? If you take an unsympathetic view, that's exactly what he's doing. He's twisting the scriptures to support his view.
Because they had then adopted this text, not necessarily knowing it was a translation. But they saw the text as very, very important.
He believes he's justified in doing that, and Christians over the centuries have said, yes, Paul is justified in doing that because what he says is true. Jesus is the Messiah anticipated in all of ancient Israel. The Gentiles are part of God's people. Maybe even they've replaced the Jews as God's people in a lot of traditional Christian thinking. These things really were written for us. Paul is right, yea, Paul. So the Christians are coming along and saying, making the rather audacious claim that the Jews do not rightly understand their own scriptures. Because within Christianity, all the way through history, is this assumption that the Jewish scriptures were not written just for the Jews. They were not written just about Israel, that they are talking about Christianity in one way, shape, or form. And so therefore we have a right, because they are our scriptures, to go back and mine those texts for meanings that may not have been intended or known by the original authors, but that were known by God. And that God can now lead us into the right understanding. Now, obviously that opens up all kinds of cans of worms.
And Professor, from Christian point of view, without this translation, would Christianity prevail like it did? Would it be a different religion, maybe?
Maybe a different religion. Very hard to say. If let's do some counterfactual history. If the translation was never made, the Christian movement would have been speaking Aramaic, and they probably would have, therefore, in terms of a tradition, may well have merely stayed in the area of Syria, Transjordan, Judah, as Aramaic speakers. By having Greek, they were able to spread into Asia Minor, into Greece, and ultimately to Rome. So certainly without Greek, Christianity would not have had the dominance it had now. Maybe they would have done their own translation, or maybe eventually some people would speak Greek. But if you were speaking Greek, but you're speaking Greek about a text that is Hebrew, it wouldn't make sense at all. So they needed something in Greek if they were going to use that text. Without the text, they are no longer a people of the book. They would be a small cultic group who may well have actually died out when the temple was destroyed, because they were temple focused initially, the early Christian movement. And if you lose the temple and you don't have a religious text to continue the message, then you may not have lasted. So there's much truth in saying actually the Septuagint translation paved the way for Christianity. It's fascinating if we think about it. This is the first religious tradition really building itself up on translation.
The principle, if we try to follow it, is why we get the thousands of Protestant denominations with all kinds of different teachings, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, is there a way out of that? In a sense, no. Really, essentially, grammatical historical interpretation, which is what I meant by the real meaning of the text, is in looking at the history and the literature context. That is a way of trying to honor a set of interpretations above other interpretations. And one of the funny things in literary studies the last few decades is basically to say texts don't have meanings. Meanings are either in the author alone, who brings them to the text, or they emerge in the engagement of an author with a text. So we might say that in many ways what Paul is doing is what readers have always done with all texts when they're in a community that has an identity that they want to apply those. So they're all driven by similar concerns, pastoral concerns and meaning-making concerns, to understand who they are, their place in history, what they should be doing, and what is coming ahead. The right doctrine from the wrong texts. In other words, one could still argue, if you wished to, as a Christian, Paul does screwy things with texts, but his intentions are good and the meaning he derives from it is true, even if he isn't really getting them from these texts. So, if he got it right, he sure didn't do it the way we would. In fact,
historically, from a Jewish perspective, was it the right move to translate this Hebrew text into the Greek and eventually helping for the Christianity to rise and rule the world?